Hey everybody, Heather here. Today we are going to be working on our monthly kit for August, and it's this cute Whimsy Stamps Snoozin stamp. Isn't it cute? I love it. It's just adorable. And I've already stamped my image on Canson 140 pound watercolor paper with archival jet black ink. So let's get started. Okay, so this time I'm going to start by coloring my tree first. There's a lot of work on the tree, so I'm just going to start with that and then do the boy afterwards. So for the tree, I started out by covering the whole tree with antique linen, and I have my medium water brush. It's the green one. I've already checked to make sure it's wet enough with my paper towel. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of my antique linen on my brush, and I always lay down my brush where I want it to be darkest the most. So I want it to be dark right here in these little creases. Even though I'm going to color the whole tree, I always put my ink down first where I want it to shadow the most. So in case I have excess there, that's where it will be pooling. I'm just going to quickly go over the whole tree. Grab a little bit more. And again, lay your brush down. If you grab more ink, put it down where you want it to be darkest first. And I'm just using the water that's in my brush to brush the rest of the ink out here into the middle of my image. It's got a little bit of a tree trunk right here underneath of his legs. So I'm going to go right along that. And that looks pretty good for our first coat, so I'm going to go ahead and let that dry for just a second. Okay, so I've let my first layer dry, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to darken it up just a little bit more here down at the bottom of the tree. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of my antique linen down here at the bottom. Kind of get in between some of these little flower petals and leaves down here just a little bit. Maybe dab just a little bit more right here in the middle. And every time I leave the paper with my brush, I have a little piece of paper towel right over here that I'm wiping my brush off on because it's collecting excess ink and a little bit more water than I want. So I just take my paper towel and wipe it off on there every time my brush leaves the page. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry, and then we're going to add vintage photo. Okay, so I've grabbed me a little bit of my vintage photo, and again, you want to start where you want it to be the darkest. So I want my tree to be darkest where all these little creases are first. So I'm going to go ahead and lay down just a little bit of my vintage photo along this line of my crease in the tree. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and then I'm just going to use the water that I have on my brush to spread the ink out towards the edge. Like that. Okay, then we'll grab a little bit more and do the next line. spread my ink out. See how it's starting to get some definition in there in between the lines? And don't forget, if your brush is feeling a little bit dry, to give it a little squeeze to add a little bit more water. And then he's got a little bit of the tree where he's really leaning against it right here, so I'm going to get quite a bit in here, right behind his back. Because it's going to be dark and shadowed back there. I'm just using the ink I've picked up on my brush to carry down here onto the bottom of the stump a little bit. And then I'm just going to use a little bit to fill in this little space right here. But see how the tree's already taken on a little bit of definition and it's turning a little bit darker? So let's add a little bit right here in this crease of the tree. And I'm going to darken up this underneath of his leg a little bit more. Okay, and then I'm going to let that dry for just a second. Okay, now I'm going to switch to Walnut Stain, and I've switched brushes to this fine detail tip brush just because I want to get into these cracks just a little bit more. So I've grabbed a little bit of my Walnut Stain, and again, lay down your brush where you want it to be the darkest. Needed a little bit more ink there. I had more water than I had ink. I'm just going to put a little bit in each of these little cracks and kind of spread it out just a little bit. Give my tree a little bit more definition. Smooth out my line. Go over here and get these two over here. Just a little bit. And I want to get a little bit behind the boy here. Even though we put quite a bit down with our vintage photo, we want to darken him up still more. So he's casting quite a shadow right there. And I'm trying to be careful not to touch his clothes. Let it get too wet. Add a little bit down here underneath of his leg. Smooth it out. And let's get over here and get this crack. I have just a little bit on my brush, so I'm using that to kind of add a little bit more in here in the center part in between these flowers, because there's not hardly any ink on there. But I want to darken it up just a little bit. I'm going to go up here and add some more to this one right here. Okay, we're going to let that dry for just a minute, and then we're going to come back and add some more color on there. Okay, so I let that dry for a couple of minutes, and now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to go back over it with vintage photo again, because I want to make the tree a little bit more of a reddish color. So I'm going to I've switched back to my medium brush, and I've grabbed me a little bit of my vintage photo onto my brush, and I'm going to darken the tree up down here at the bottom. I'm going to start down at the bottom and just pull the ink up onto the tree. I'm going to try not to touch too much of this leaf with my puppy here. And I'm just going to carefully go around these flowers, but just give the tree a little bit of a reddish, more of a reddish tint than the yellowish color I've got going on. But it's all personal preference. You're going to color your tree how you want, and it might take you a little bit of practice. So you might want to stamp your image before you get started on your card. Stamp it first on a scratch piece, and maybe try practicing coloring your tree, and then come back and color your image after you've tried it one or a couple of times. I'm trying not to get too much on the little flowers here. Yeah. Okay, let's darken up here a little bit. And give it just a little dab in here. Oh, we better not forget our little heart. Alright, so I've let that dry for a couple of minutes, And now I want to go back in and add a little bit more shadows on my tree where the little lines are. So I'm going to grab some more of my Walnut Stain. And I'm just going to add just a little bit in the cracks where I think the tree has a little bit of an indentation. And then just lightly smooth it with just water. And I'm going to do just the edge of this little heart. There's a little bit of a crease in there. Like that. I think I'll go down here and add maybe a little bit more to edge of this one right here. But that just gives it a little bit more definition. Also, what works really great are the new distress markers for putting the little lines in there, because it has this great fine tip. So I've grabbed my Walnut Stain marker, and see the little pointy tip? It's just got a little bitty point, and you can just go in and you can add just a line right where you exactly want it. Like that. And then you can go back with your brush and just very lightly go over it with just water in your brush, just to soften the edges just a little bit. So same for these, you just go in, and it's great for adding just really strong highlighted areas. Definitely helps add those shadows right in the crease where you want them. Like that. And then you just go in with your water brush, and I just very lightly tap over the top of it just to soften it a little bit with the water. Or up here where this little where your little heart is, it's great for coloring in that little small space where that looks like it's the tree's carved out. So that's the tree, so let's move on to the boy. Okay, so for my boy, I'm going to start by coloring his skin. So for that, I'm going to use Tattered Rose to start. So I've grabbed me a little bit of my Tattered Rose, and lay down your brush where you want it to be darkest again. So I want it to be darkest over here where his hat is shading his face. And then I'm just going to use that little bit, wipe my brush off, and then use this little bit I laid down to color clear over here onto his neck and his little ear. Okay, and we'll go down and get his arm. And again, I'm going to lay down my ink underneath on the bottom side of his arm, so it's going to be darkest down there. And then I'm going to use the ink I laid down to color in the rest of his hand and his arm. Just got a little bit of an arm showing on this side. And he's got his foot. So go ahead and I'm going to lay my ink down here at the bottom of his foot. And then just use that to bring clear up to his toes. He's got just a little bitty patch of foot showing right here. Okay, and I don't think I got enough on his arm the first time, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit more and come up and put just a little bit more of this pink tone on there. Pink it up just a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to add a little bit of shadow. And for the shadows on his face, I'm going to use Tattered Rose and tea dye that I've mixed together. And so I got tired of mixing it every single time, so I now have a little droplet inside my ink palette that I just mixed up, and that's what I'm going to use, as I already have it mixed up in there. Since I'm constantly using it, I didn't see any sense in mixing it every single time and wiping it off. I figured I might as well just make some up and leave it in the little empty container there. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit of my my mixed Tattered Rose and tea dye, and I want it to be where I want him to be shadowed the most first. So I want it to be shadowed on this side of his face, underneath of his little hat. And I'm just going to put a little bit and then just kind of brush it lightly towards the back. So it'll just shadow his face just a little bit. And same thing for his arm. I want his arm to be darkest down here at the bottom. So I'm just going to add a little bit of that down here at the bottom, and then just lightly brush it up to blend it in with the Tattered Rose you already laid down. And we'll get his foot, and get down here at the bottom of his foot, and right here a little bit in between where his toe would be casting a shadow on the bottom of his foot. And then wipe my brush off, and then just use just water to lightly brush it up and blend it into the rest of your foot. I better get a little bit over here on this hand too. Like that. And then we're going to let that dry, and we're going to do his hair. Okay, so for his hair, we're going to start out by using scattered straw. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit of that onto my brush. And I want it to be darkest, down here at the bottom. So I'm just going to lay down my scattered straw, maybe a little bit up here at the top. And I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm going to cover his whole hair up with just that little bit that I laid down, just to give it a little bit of a yellowish cast to it. So underneath, so when you get done painting it, if you missed a couple of spots, you'll still have that little bit of yellow peeking through. Okay, so that's going to be drying. So while that is drying, we're going to go down here and let's color the puppy because he's not touching anything. So for the dog, I used old paper first. So let me grab that. So grab me a little bit of old paper onto my brush. And I just used that to color, I just colored the whole thing. So I just went in and scrubbed over him his whole body, and then later, after he dried, I'm going to come back and color, give him some dark spots on his ear. That gets him his first coat. So while we colored that, his hair has dried. So let's go up to his hair, and we're going to add some vintage photo onto our scattered straw that we already laid down. So we're going to grab a little bit of our vintage photo, and I want it to be, again, I want it to start out darkest down here at the bottom. So I'm going to just brush a little bit of that on like that. And then I'm going to, my brush is almost empty, but I'm going to go ahead and wipe the excess ink off my brush. And I'm just going to use the ink I laid down to wipe up towards the top of his hair. And I'm going to grab a little bit more. I'm going to do the same thing for the top. I'm going to put a little bit up here at the top of his hair, and then just use what I laid down to wipe down towards the middle of his head. And you let it dry in between layers, and then when it's dry, you come back, we're going to add another layer. But while that's drying, let's go down and add some color to our puppy again. So I'm going to grab a little bit of brushed corduroy, and I colored his ears with that. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of brown to his little ear. And he's got just a little bit of ear poking out right here. So I'm going to get that. And then after my brush is almost empty, there's hardly any ink left on there from doing the puppy, I'm just going to lightly add a little bit of this brown onto the rest of his body. And give it just a little bit of a brownish tint to it. That adds a little bit more color onto him. Okay, so let's go back up to his hair, and I'm going to get some more of my vintage photo and add just a little bit more color on here. I want him to be a little bit darker, I think. There, his hair's looking nice. Okay, so for his hair too, I added some rusty Hinge. I gave it a little bit of a red cast, so let's find that one in my ink palette tray here. While that's drying a little bit. Okay, so for Rusty Hinge, I'm going to grab a little bit of that on my brush, and make sure your brush is still wet. If it's not flowing very well, give it a little squeeze on in your tank there. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of this orange, just to give it a little bit, kind of a reddish, more of a reddish orange colored cast to it. He's got multiple colored hair today. I got a little bit on his hat there, so let me smooth that out just a little bit. And see if we can dab it up with our paper towel a little bit. Okay, I'm liking his hair, so we're going to leave that sit and let that dry for a little bit.